Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. There's an old SNL sketch, a Saturday Night Live sketch. It was in the days of Will Ferrell, so it was kind of a golden age during this time. This sketch that I really liked, I thought it was hilarious. It was very simple. The idea was that Will Ferrell was the dad, and there was a lady who was the mother, and there was a sort of a teenage daughter, and they were all sitting down at a dinner table, and it was just this painfully awkward dinner. They're all sitting there at the dinner table, kind of, you can hear them scraping and clanking their forks, and it's dead quiet, and it goes like that for a few minutes, and then they just erupt in these arguments, these little family squabbles. And they're these ridiculous arguments, and they shout at each other, yell at each other, and then it all goes quiet, and you can hear them kind of scraping and clanking their forks again. And it kind of goes back and forth like this for a while. It's really funny. You should look it up. But what makes this sketch for me funny and awkward is that I know, and we know, that family meals are obviously not supposed to look like this. You know, this is not the ideal. These meals are not supposed to be characterized by shouts and awkward silences. That's not what meals are supposed to look like. Meals have a kind of sacredness to them. And it's interesting that even outside of Christianity, people have some idea of this. You know, even non-religious folk have some reverence for meal times. People just sort of get that meal times, sharing a meal together, eating, has this kind of sacred quality to it. There's a wonderful book by a theologian, a guy by the name of Alexander Schmemann. He has a great name. He's an Eastern Orthodox guy, but he's very well loved by many Anglicans. And he wrote this book called For the Life of the World. And he talks in this book about the sacredness of meals. He talks about how God made human beings fundamentally to be hungry, and he gave them a world of food to take in. He gave them a world which human beings were not to merely consume for its own sake, but to partake of as God's gift. And in fact, God's original intention for creation was that human beings would consume of it as a kind of communion with God. Now, of course, in the fall of humankind, humanity chose to not eat in this God-ordained way. Human beings chose to eat selfishly. We ate the fruit of the world for its own sake, and we died because of it. That's the fall. And yet there lives on, even in the secular world, a sense of what eating really should be, what it really ought to be. I want to read this quote to you from Alexander Schmemann's book. He says this: "Centuries of secularism have failed to transform eating into something strictly utilitarian. Food is still treated with reverence. A meal is still a rite. The last, quote-unquote, natural sacrament of family and friendship, of life that is more than eating and drinking. To eat," Schmemann says, "is still something more than to maintain bodily functions. People may not understand what that something more is, but they nonetheless desire to celebrate it. They are still hungry and thirsty for sacramental life." Now, what I mean by talking about all this, and what I think that Schmemann means by what he wrote, is that food still, even in our fallen state, food still points to something higher. It points to higher realities. In fact, it's meant not only to draw us closer to each other, which happens during meal times. We draw closer to each other. That happens, but it's also meant to draw us upwards into the life of God himself. And this principle, this idea, it plays out in the Bible all the time in a number of different places. Shimon notes that feasting or banqueting, having a banquet, is, to quote him again, the central image of life in the Bible. It is the image of life at its creation and also the image of life at its end and fulfillment, the great marriage feast. In between the beginning and the end of the Bible, all in between, we find God commanding feasts. We find him prescribing and proscribing certain kinds of foods. And of course, we find God providing food where there is a lack of food. We find him supplying that health, that lack. We find him filling that void as an image and a foretaste of the final healing, the final feast that is to come. In this morning's readings, we actually see a couple of instances of God stepping in to provide a meal or meals for his people. So first of all, the first feeding event that we have in our readings this morning is the classic story of God providing manna in the wilderness for the Hebrew people following the Exodus. And we see this event alluded to actually a couple of different times. So in our reading from Nehemiah chapter 9, which is a prayer of Ezra, in which he describes God's faithfulness to his people, we see him describing this event in Israel's history. And then again in our psalm that we read together, Psalm 78, starting in verse 27, we read about how God rained down flesh upon them like dust, and winged birds like the sand of the sea. He let it fall in the midst of their camp and round about their dwellings. So they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved. Again, two different moments of Old Testament people reflecting on this event in the early history of Israel, this wonderful miracle in the wilderness. It's a familiar story, and it looms large not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. We see references to this event in the wilderness popping up all the time. Now, the second feeding event that we read about this morning is, of course, the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew chapter 14. And if this story kind of sounds like or has some resonance with the feeding in the wilderness, the Old Testament feeding in the wilderness, then you're picking up on something important. There's actually a connection there. One of the things that Matthew wants us to think about in his gospel book is the similarity between Jesus and Moses. And we know that, of course, that Jesus is greater than Moses, right? Moses wasn't the Messiah. He was not the incarnate Son of God. But nevertheless, Matthew wants us to connect these dots. And he wants us to see the continuity. He wants us to see the fulfillment that happens in Jesus. And there's lots that could be said about that. We could talk about Jesus in his famous Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, how he gives his authoritative interpretation of the law of Moses. We could talk about how in that moment he looks a lot like Moses, who himself came down from a mountain, namely Mount Sinai, with the law. So there's another moment of similarity and connection between Moses and Jesus. That Moses-Jesus connection is strong. Now in Matthew 14, Jesus, like Moses, is providing food for God's people in a miraculous way. In both situations, we find people in the wilderness without food. The disciples in the story from Matthew 14, they describe this as a lonely place. And in both situations, God comes through in a supernatural way. In the desert, he had rained this bizarre bread-like substance on his people that they subsequently named manna. And he also brought them quails so that they could have some meat. So that was what happened before. And now in the wilderness near Galilee, Jesus takes a small portion of bread and fish, and after he blesses it and he takes it, and he gives it back to his disciples. It's miraculously able to feed 5,000 hungry men, not to mention all of the women and children. But as I said before, Jesus is, of course, greater than Moses, and the feeding that Jesus brings, ultimately, is far greater than the feeding that happens with Moses. And we get a hint of that truth even in the little detail that 12 baskets of broken pieces were left over. That's a sort of seemingly innocuous detail in the narrative, but whenever we come across that number 12 in the Bible, we ought to pause and consider what might be going on here. What's the purpose of this number? 12, of course, is the number of the apostles, that special group of men chosen and sent from the greater body of Jesus' disciples. And then even more foundational than that is the number of the tribes of Israel, 12. So to have 12 baskets worth of overabundance is profound. As one commentator suggests, N.T. Wright, the famous theologian, he suggests that this very well might be pointing us to Jesus' project of restoration. By the 12 baskets of overabundant food, we realize that Jesus wants to bring new health. He wants to bring new life in abundance to the people of God. And he accomplishes that project. Jesus accomplishes that project of healing and restoration as no one before him ever did or could, even the great Moses. To borrow a line of Jesus from John's Gospel, your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and they died. But this, Jesus says, is the bread which comes down from heaven, that a man may eat of it and not die. Now here we're entering into something larger than the feeding of the 5,000. But it's something that this miracle points to, which is Jesus' giving of his own self, his own life, to satisfy our deepest hunger, which we experience in this wilderness of life. Jesus goes on in that passage from John to say, I am the living bread, which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread which I shall give for the life of the world is my flesh. When humanity fell away from God, when we chose our own path, when we ate that fruit of pride and idolatry, we brought death into ourselves. Again, that's the fall of man. We began to dissolve at that point. We began to fall apart and sink into chaos and destruction and death. But Jesus wants us to feast on his own self, his own life, that we might be filled with that victory that he won over death and the grave. The feeding of the 5,000 points to this work that Jesus would do and does among us even today. It points us to the Eucharist. It's not a coincidence that Jesus' language here, his verbiage, when he's handling the loaves and the fishes, it matches up with Eucharistic language elsewhere in the New Testament. As one commentator points out, we see the same progression of actions here in Matthew 14 as we find in the Last Supper narrative. So in both places, Jesus takes, he gives thanks or he blesses, he breaks, and then he gives. Now, of course, our Eucharist may not include fish, but the trajectory is very clear. This feeding miracle of the 5,000 opens our eyes to the miraculous giving of new life that Jesus effects for us and which we experience in a special way at the altar. This morning, as we come to this altar, which is also, by the way, kind of like a dinner table, I pray that we would come to him with truly hungry hearts. We know that Jesus wants to give us his new life So let's receive it. Let's receive that life, and let's let it permeate our whole beings. Now, of course, we should be warned that taking in the life of Jesus is risky. Who knows what it will mean for us, right? Who knows what Jesus will cut away in us? Who knows what he will transform in us? But whatever the case, we know that it's for our good. We know that the result of receiving Jesus in love and in faith is always true and unending life. So let's receive that life this morning. And may the Lord bring us in the end to that great marriage feast where we will enjoy his life and his presence forever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.